Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Make a Difference webinar, which is sponsored by Feel Good. And it's going to be looking at how we tackle toxicity and forge a culture of mental health and resilience in the workplace. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Claire Farrow. I'm the Global Head of Content for Make a Difference Media, and I also look after the content for our annual Mad World Summit and our new event, which is called the Water Cooler, which is coming up in May. With more than 280 registrants, we've had another fantastic response to today's session, and it's great to see such a wide range of sectors taking an interest in this really important topic. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Jill Williams, who is lead organisational psychologist with Feel Good. But before I do that, I've got a few housekeeping notes for you. So first of all, I wanted to let you know that the session is being recorded. And that we'll be sharing the recording with you a couple of days after the session. So please keep an eye out for the email that will come to you with the link to follow. We like our webinars to be as interactive as possible. So the way we do that is that we encourage people to chat away. And I can see some people already started to chat. So put your comments in the chat, chat with one another, share ideas and experiences. It's a great way to connect with people and to learn from each other as well as from the speakers. And you can pop your questions in there as well, or you can use the Q&A. And don't save all your questions to the end, because we will keep feeding them through to people. The only thing I'd say is, if you're a supplier in this space, please don't use the opportunity to kind of pitch your products and services, because that's not really what the chat's for. So you could say that for another time, please. So I also wanted to remind you that today's webinar is a slightly different format. We get so many questions that with this one, we've decided to extend the Q&A session. So the webinar will run from 10 till 11. And then we've got 30 minutes where the panelists have kindly agreed to stay on and be here to answer kind of more in-depth questions. So if you've got time to stay on, that'd be wonderful. And we'd love to see as many of you as possible staying with us till the end. Okay, so we've got another fantastic panel today, and Jill's going to introduce them to you. So over to you, Jill.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire, and thank you so much for having us today. We're absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to collaborate with Make a Difference and to have this conversation with everyone who's here today. So we are Feel Good. We are a business that is focused and obsessed by making positive change in organizations. We bring together our extensive experience in the wellbeing and the culture change space to help HR, L&D, OD, and business leaders make tangible, sustainable, positive change in the cultures of their organizations. So through our many years of running wellbeing programs, running leadership programs, and supporting organizations with their culture and the wellbeing strategy, we've helped lots of organizations be able to do just that, and to tackle the things in their businesses that were perhaps holding them back from thriving, both in terms of their performance, but in terms of everybody's well-being as well. So that's us. My name, as Claire said, is Jill Williams. I am an organisational psychologist, and I've been working in the space of culture change, well-being and leadership development for about 15 years today. And I am absolutely delighted to be joined by some people that we know well and who I know have lots to share with all of us today in terms of how we address this question of tackling toxicity and forging a culture of positive mental health and improved well-being in the workplace. So over the course of the next hour, I will be in conversation with Liz Pillans, who is the Talent Acquisition and Development Manager at DeLonghi, Claire Hallmey, who is the International Wellbeing Manager at Oracle, and Health and Wellbeing expert Leeanne Young. And I know they've got lots of experience and lots of views that they'll be able to share with you today. So I'm really pleased that you've all been able to join us for the conversation. And as Claire has said, keep the questions coming, keep the chat coming. We want this to be a conversation that we're all in. So do please interact with all of us, add any questions you have for the panelists into the chat as we get going. Now, before the four of us dive into our conversation, let's start by just thinking about this topic at hand, thinking about the impact of how we work, the way in which we work, our cultures, on mental health and well-being. And I'd like to start with a poll. And we're going to launch a poll here and ask you to think about the factors that have greatest influence on the mental well-being of yourselves, your colleagues, people you support in your businesses. So you might look at this and you might think, okay, there's quite a lot here. There's a number of things in this poll that have an impact, but I want you to think about what is the thing that really stands out here. So which factor do you think recently has had the biggest negative impact on the mental health for you and your colleagues? We're looking at factors such as job intensity and workload levels, working hours, perhaps a lack of inclusivity and belonging, not having enough contact with people's direct managers or their leaders, toxic behaviors, which might come in any form. Could be anything from bullying to blame behaviors and so on. Inefficient systems, processes, or ways of working. The type of work people are doing. So perhaps doing repetitive, mundane work. Constant change and ambiguity, something we've all faced and are continuing to face. Or maybe something specific about your culture or something else, some other systemic factor that we haven't listed here. Which do you think is the biggest negative impact? You might say there's a number of these, and there might be things that interact with each other, but what one stands out for you? Okay, so we'll take a moment, have a think, reflect on everything you've seen, and we will give that a couple of minutes to see what everyone thinks about this. So we're looking at working hours, blame culture, lack of inclusivity and belonging, not having enough contact with managers, perhaps toxic behaviors, other systemic factors, those personal challenges as well. We'll leave that open for a minute. And do let us know why you've selected the choice that you've selected in the poll. What is it that you've seen about this factor that has had greatest impact? So if it was a lack of inclusivity, what's been shaping that? If we're talking about working hours specifically, is it the hours? Is it the workload? Is it the intensity of the job? Do let us know in the chat what you think is the specific, if I could get my words out this morning, specific factor that's been shaping this. Great, we'll leave that open for about another 10, 15 seconds or so. So if you haven't voted, do vote now. What's the one that stands out? Okay. So thank you for
joining in the chat, Jill, as well, sharing their workload, restructure.
So what we have here is people who don't feel included, they feel aggrieved, so when they feel excluded, so that actually changes their behavior. It shifts that contract, that psychological contract with the organization. Lack of connection to the company and colleagues, lack of sense of belonging and purpose, maybe difficulty separating those work-life boundaries when working from home that we've all experienced recently. Also thinking about perhaps some really toxic behaviors, bullying leadership perhaps, and the impact that's had on how someone feels on their mental health and their emotional health. Perhaps thinking again about more about working hours, workload, feeling overwhelmed and not being taken seriously. So this is a theme we're hearing a lot at Feel Good coming through around the intensity of our work and the load of our work and what that is left in terms of the pressure faced on people. Absolutely. Lack of accountability. So does that mean perhaps people in the culture aren't taking accountability, so that there's this gray area, and we know that we thrive when we are clear, we have that clarity, but also accountability does a lot for our mental health. Absolutely. Thinking about the impact of the pandemic on multiple levels, that shift in social interaction, the personal health as well, from being at home too much, not having that time together, but also maybe not moving as much and that having an impact. Isolation linking here as well to this theme of social connection. So thinking about what does that mean about relationships? And we know that good quality relationships, feeling part of a community, is so important for mental health, and work can provide that. We're really seeing that coming through as well. Lack of empathy, lack of sociable behaviors. So getting into that idea of what could toxic behaviors look like and how do they affect how we feel? So if someone isn't tapping into providing the emotional support we need, that sense of connection, that's going to erode our mental health as well. Absolutely. So thinking that personal well-being and professional well-being should exist separately, and how to integrate it all. Really interesting comment there, because that's one of the things we want to think about today. So how do we look at a whole system approach to improving the mental health of our employees? How do we think about the fact that it isn't work-life balance, but it's work-life integration or blend? And we need to take a much more systemic view on the factors that are affecting how people feel. Absolutely. So there's so much here that you're sharing in the chat that really resonates for me from all of my consultancy work and all my coaching work as we see this coming through. And what we can see is that there's definitely core themes coming through. So if we could share the results of the poll so everyone can see how everyone has voted, that would be great. And we're seeing a great spread here. Really interesting to see that a huge amount of different organizations on the session today, and we've got very different results. So we have in the top spot here, we have 33% of toxic behaviors. And I think we're seeing some of those coming through in the chat, everything from lack of empathy, perhaps to bullying behaviors. We're then seeing personal challenges. So thinking about what am I facing outside of work? That idea of actually that being an integral part of how I feel in work and not being something that is separate, that we just shut the door on when we go to work, but instead recognizing that we all come to work with a load on our shoulders and the workplace can support that. Absolutely. So coming in second place, then around 25% for working hours. And I'm sure from the comments in the chat, job intensity and workload fits under that category as well. And then into the lack of inclusivity and belonging, 22%. So what we see at Feel Good really aligns with everything that you're sharing here in the chat and what the poll is saying as well. We know that work can be a force for so much good in terms of our mental health. It provides us with that sense of purpose, that sense of achievement, accountability. It gives us an opportunity to grow and advance. We can connect with other people, be part of a meaningful community, and have good quality relationships. We know good work that is designed in this way enhances mental well-being. But over the last 18 months at Feel Good, we've been asking the question of, is actually the way we work broken? Because everything that you're describing here in the poll and the chat, we are seeing across every industry. We have started to wonder, have we reached a point where the modern way of working actually erodes mental health and it doesn't provide these factors? So we've been doing some research, we've been working with our clients to address this. And we're seeing that there's very strong accepted norms in national cultures, in sector cultures, and in specific organizational cultures that have meant for far too long, we've been putting the business, the commercial needs at the heart of how we work and forgetting about the human experience. But the pandemic and the mental health crisis that is emerging from the pandemic, with reports from McKinsey saying that pretty much close to 50% of employees are burnt out right now, and 1 in 3 employees considering leaving their work because of their mental health, according to the World Economic Forum, we know that this has reached a boiling point. We've got this burning platform of, we can't go on like this. For social reasons, for sustainability reasons, we absolutely cannot. And we need to think about how we potentially redesign how we work to put this human experience and mental health at the core. Let's overcome the impact of job intensity. Let's address some of these toxic behaviors or cultural norms that you're all sharing in the chat. So now there has never been more of an important time to do this. And in working in this space and really thinking about, do we need to shake up how we work over the last year? At Feel Good, we have really realized the power of community. And that's why I'm so pleased to see so many people on today's session. Because if we wait for things to change, we might be waiting a really long time, but we can all be part of that change. And what we hope to do through the rest of the conversation today is help ignite some of that change, share ideas from some fantastic organizations and experts. And we would love you to share in the chat as well your solutions for creating real, tangible, and sustainable change to how we work to improve mental well-being, because we each can be part of that social change rather than waiting for it to happen. So let's dive into this and let's start to share some of our learnings and some of our ideas and yours as well. And Liz, I would love to come to you first. And I know that over your extensive career, you've worked on mental well-being for some time. And I'd love to know from your experience, what has impacted the mental health of employees most? Is it things like what we're talking about in the poll, or have you seen different factors?
Absolutely. I think there's been, lots of comments that have very much resonated with me. But I think the one thing for me, through my experience, that I wanted to share was actually the impact starts at the very top of the organisation. And I've seen a very positive impact when you have strong leaders who are there for their people, who really get, you know, what it means to be a good leader. So they're living the values, they're there for their people, they really genuinely care for them, and they have a deep understanding actually of well-being, and particularly, you know, the connection between physical and mental well-being. So they get that, and they know the link back to them and their behaviours. So, you know, I've seen this, they really set the tone and the culture for an organisation. Likewise, in other organisations where I've worked, I've seen the impact that invisible leaders can have. So those leaders that believe actually the numbers are more important than the people. Now we need to get that balance, don't we? Obviously, results are extremely important, but they shouldn't be to the detriment of the well-being of individuals as well. So it's those managers actually that can have a negative impact on mental well-being, you know, where they're not listening, the communication is poor, they're not dealing with poor behaviour, and that really creates a lot of mistrust and anxiety amongst employees.
Absolutely. I think a number of people would agree with you in the chat here, saying, you know, business owners disregarding the mental effect of working from home. So actually, you know, what is that senior leadership doing? Are they behind this? Are they sponsoring it? Are they communicating with employees? Are they supporting them? Absolutely. So I think there's lots of people here, Liz, that agree with you. And I think this idea of both the visible leaders, but also the invisible ones is really important, because sometimes we find it feel good that if you do have a visible senior leadership team who perhaps haven't quite bought into the strategic agenda for this, you can create really positive cultural change in your organization by getting into those invisible networks. Who are the people that are influencing, and really working with those? Absolutely. So Leeanne, I'm keen to come to you and sort of build on what Liz has been sharing here. You know, this idea of leadership, of communication, of those behaviors and how they impact well-being. In your experience, if you feel that there's organizational factors like these or like others that people are sharing in the chat this morning, what do you do about this? How do you understand how they're affecting people's well-being, and how do you understand how to make real, tangible, sustainable change?
Thanks, Jill. That's a really good question. And I think I've been looking at the chat and just sort of seeing what people are saying. And we can see when these things are actually happening. And I think that's the key here. It's all about foreseeable risk. Foreseeable risk has got to be managed, because if we ignore that, we know how harmful it can be to businesses from a reputational point of view. You've spoken about mass resignations, but also from a financial perspective as well, the impact to individuals, not just in the workplace, but also the impact to their home lives and their families. And also, I think we need to understand as well the risk of not doing something or managing foreseeable risk is the impact that it has on wider society. You know, let's think about the NHS, government benefit schemes, etc. So really, it's about identifying first, and then managing both physical and psychological risk. We all manage health and safety. You know, we see that posted, don't we, in our offices every day about managing health and safety risks. So anything that impacts us psychologically doesn't need to be different. So in terms of what can we do to create real change, I think first and foremost there needs to be an acknowledgement of the challenges and the need for change. There needs to be a clear commitment to change, and as Liz said, from the very top of the organisation. And also, I think it's really important that there's a development of a transparent action plan with key milestones that actually needs to be achieved. So I think the crucial element there is the development of an action plan, and that's the most practical thing that we can all do in the workplace. In order to do that, we've really got to get to ground, I would say. You cannot just have a group of people that may lack diversity coming up with actions for the whole business. You can't do that. You've got to get to ground to really understand what the issues are, observe what people are doing, how are they interacting, what are they saying, because you can't do this from behind a desk. I would say the second thing to do would be to do this. There are so many organisations out there that have got similar challenges, but also some organisations that are doing some fantastic things, and we can learn from each other. So try to identify best practice. When you know what's happening in your business and on the ground, and you've got the best practice, you then need to put those two together and then come up with some actions that really gonna have some impact that you know are also going to work. And then I would say, and just to pick up on someone's point in the chat, and I'm conscious that I'm talking probably too long, is when we come up with actions, sometimes we've got all this energy, we put things together, we put out the action plans, we make a commitment, and then we leave it. And we don't go back to them. You know, are the actions still relevant? Are they actually having an impact? If you've sent out staff surveys, you need to revisit those. You might need to change some of the actions as well. There's nothing wrong with changing something if it's not having the impact that you want it to have. But also, in terms of when I spoke about developing this action plan and sharing that and communicating it around the business, I think you've also got to be quite careful and manage the expectations, because this is, or would be, transformational change for a number of organisations. This might be something that they haven't really thought about. When you've done that fact-finding exercise, there could be so much that comes out and you're thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to manage this? So really being very clear with everybody and saying that this might take some time. But if you do that, I think what you're doing then is you're not only being honest, you then will be able to build some trust, and then you'll get the traction that you'll need in terms of achieving those particular actions. So I hope that sort of helps. And or just quickly, I would also say that as you're revisiting the actions, it's probably quite good to also celebrate success. And it might be something quite small, but again, that just inspires people to keep going. You know, celebrate those small successes. That's really important.
Absolutely. I think this idea of, let's be honest about the fact that it might need transformational change is so important. It feels as though often the tackling of mental well-being and just general well-being at work has been put in to really get to the root cause, that's too difficult. So let's put it over here, or let's use the cultural excuse of, but that's just our industry. That's what it's like in financial services. That's what it's like in tech. That's what it's like in manufacturing. And actually what we've been doing is we've been trying to treat problems, trying to treat the symptoms, but actually it's felt too difficult to look at what's the root cause? How do we build a culture that prevents all of that risk that you've just spoken about, Leeanne? But also, how do we help our organizations heal and move into this phase of healing and doing something different? And you're right, that isn't going to change overnight. That is going to require a sustained organizational change effort. But if organizations want to still be in existence and well and healthy and have their teams in the future, they've got to be honest with themselves, exactly as you say. I couldn't agree with you more. We've got to move from just assuming we know what the symptoms are, trying to treat them, and instead really understanding in our unique context, what do we need to address? Clients say to us all the time, but you're the experts, tell us what's the off-the-shelf solution. There is no one size fits all, because to your point about diversity, we have wonderfully diverse organizations and they're going to need something different to get to the same outcome sometimes. So I love what you're saying about the tangibility of the action plan and really knowing in your context what is right for you, but also this idea of revisit it, assess it, put in controls and really tangibly measure it, but recognize things are constantly changing. So you're going to have to iterate what you do as you go along as well. Absolutely. So Liz, just coming back to you here, then thinking about this idea of, understanding where do we need to focus? What is our action plan? Putting the parameters around it, getting that buy-in, that commitment, and really moving forward with it. What sort of things have you seen to be effective in an action plan like this, or overcoming the challenges that you and Leeanne have spoken about?
Well, from my experience, going back to starting at the top of the organisation, I think where I've had the best success has been where my starting point has been around using the same language and approach that senior managers usually take. So starting off very much, I guess, from a bottom line perspective and talking about the impact that poor mental health can have on the bottom line, and how it can affect business performance and results. And really, I think taking a more scientific approach as a starting point. So using concrete facts and examples has enabled me to get that, kind of buy-in at the very beginning at the top of the organisation. And from there, really running some very robust education programs, actually, and, making managers and leaders much more aware of the impact that culture and behaviours have on well-being in the workplace. And then giving people some very practical tools and techniques that can help us shift that organisation culture. And I think, what's interesting is I think most people, most managers and leaders don't come to work with that intention to create a poor atmosphere and, to have a detrimental impact on people. I think it's just a lack of awareness. And going back to, I think, I can't remember who mentioned it just now, but, this is the way things are done around here. Well, actually, in the past, they've probably had role models that have used a more traditional leadership style, but actually that's not going to hold any weight now. It's unsustainable and inappropriate anymore. So people, need to think about who are the new role models in the organisation that are going to lead the way in this and, provide learning for other people as well. So I think from that side, that's really where we've had the greatest success. It might not be a starting point that I would want to choose necessarily from a learning and development perspective, but it's worked and it's given us great leverage, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that idea of gaining leverage by telling this story, talking about what the change needs to be in the language of your business leaders, really helps them understand it in line with the mental models they have of what makes a successful organization. And the world has changed, the needs of people have changed, the pressure has really created this sort of boiling pot. And I think helping them understand that through their existing lens in the world is a great way to get that leverage and to get in there. And I think, when we think about taking a whole system approach, for some organizations, when they sort of go through the action planning process that you and Leeanne are talking about, they might find that they need to upend some parts of their operating model. Maybe they're going to be inspired and think about, more self-management structures or something that is actually a big change. And helping leaders understand that through their own lens and their own language is much more likely to get that buy-in. But also your point around role modeling, like I sort of feel sometimes I look at my LinkedIn feed and I feel like, who would want to be a leader right now? Who would want to be a manager? Because everything is like, this is poor culture is because of managers, leaders are to blame for this. And I'm like, are we forgetting that they're people too? They're people who've lived through this and worked through decades of this sort of, toxic culture that is the business norm at the moment of put yourself last and put business needs first. And they're exhausted. They're trying to adapt to a changing world and have a lot on their shoulders. So I think what you're talking about, supporting them with their behaviors is so important that we do that from a compassionate lens as well, rather than blaming and pointing the finger and say, hey, all managers need to solve this. This is a leadership issue. They are suffering too, and we've got to help them develop those behaviors and evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always done with that intention, that we want to arm them with the knowledge and skills, and do that in a caring way as well. Because I think, as HR professionals ourselves, we're role models within an organisation as well. So we've got to live and breathe that.
Absolutely. And before we come to Claire and get some of your views on this, one other question for you, Liz, that's coming up. There's an interesting line in the chat at the moment about gender differences. And are you finding that there is more receptivity, more support for these sorts of mental health initiatives across different genders or across any other demographic?
Actually, interestingly, no. I think within my organisation, there are always mixed views and approaches on this, but I wouldn't say it's gender or age specific, actually. I think, we've got just as many male managers as female managers that are taking a real interest in this. I lead a wellbeing team, so we have volunteers across the organisation, and we've got a really nice balance there. We've just run a mental health first aid programme with an even mix of males and females, and I think I guess every individual might approach this slightly differently, but I'm not seeing any difference. And I think this has been a long journey for us, talking about mental health and well-being. So it started 10 years ago, and I would say it's probably the pandemic actually has given us that opportunity to open up those discussions much more, and for people to be honest about how they're feeling, you know. And I think it's touched all of us, hasn't it?
I would say the same as well. I'd agree with you, Liz. I mean, my background is power and energy, and specifically utilities, and so it's a very male dominated industries. And I have to say that in my experience, I haven't found this, oh, it's the ladies that are saying, oh, let's talk about this. No, it isn't. It's everybody. Yeah. So I agree with you.
And I would add that across different age groups as well. I get asked about generational divides all the time, and it's every generation who wants to talk about it. We are all living through this mental health crisis. Gender, age, size, shape, color, everything, I think it is really opening up. And I think back to your earlier point, Leeanne, the importance of diversity in these conversations cannot be emphasized enough. That particularly, there's a risk, I think, of those of us that work in this space becoming a little echo chamber, where we see it's important and we think we know what the solutions are, but you've got to hear about those lived experiences of lots of different people to be able to really understand what those needs are. And I know there's some questions in the chat around, you know, how do you help everyone feel seen and heard and understood that the causes that are affecting how they feel are being addressed? And I think that's a very important part of, first of all, making sure we're involving everyone in the conversation. And making sure we are giving them a platform to have their voices heard, but also an opportunity to help shape what some of these solutions are, because it's going to require everyone to do that. And I think it also goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Leeanne, about, you know, go back to this again and again. So don't say, okay, we want to hear what you're struggling with. Let's do a survey. We've heard it, and then we do nothing about it. Instead, you know, what is the long-term strategic change plan and the comms plan with that is going to come back and address all of these multiple factors? And about not distilling that too much to say, oh, it's just leadership behavior, we just need to focus on that. But actually, it's that complex interaction between a lot of factors that we need to constantly be working on and revisiting, and how we're communicating about it.
Can I just say, Jill, that I think someone's had put a question in there about working in a male-dominated workforce, and it's hard to educate and change behaviours. One of the things that we did in one of the organisations that I worked for is we've used real stories from real people actually to talk about mental ill health or psychological challenges, whatever it might be. And we've had men doing this and senior men in the organisation talking about this on film and putting that out right across the business. And those are the things that really resonated, and also things like podcasts as well, you know, the male voice. And yeah, okay, so we have to accept that sometimes if you are in a very male dominated environment and you're hearing a female voice talk about you know, a mental ill health challenge or disorder, it might put you off a little bit. Sometimes you do need to hear that male voice. So representation is really important, I think. But yeah, I just wanted to share that's what we did, just to that person who had that question. Use the people that are representing the employees.
Just on that point, actually, I should say somebody pointed out we are all women, so we're not a very diverse representation, which is a bit of a change. Sometimes we struggle to find female panelists, so but it's true, perhaps something that I should consider in future.
Absolutely. Thanks, Claire. So Claire Hallmey, let's bring you into the conversation. I'm sorry, we've got lots that we want to hear from you as well. And I think where I'd like to start is thinking about this idea of behaviors. We're talking about how behaviors are an easy way in to creating a different culture. In that psychosocial environment in the organization is shaped by what we say and what we do. So I'd love to know from your experiences what you're noticing about the impact of behaviors and how to address this to improve mental health.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. And some excellent points so far. Yeah, I think it's been a really fascinating topic. And I think when you talk about managers, it's really important to think, I think we put a lot of pressure on managers. I think we put a lot of pressure on leadership, and you're right, they are burning out as well as the rest of us. But I think sometimes if we can kind of equip them with some of the tools to help them in those conversations, to help them drive some of those behaviours, actually we can start to kind of turn some of those points that might be negatively received or not received in the way that they'd intended them to be into much more positive ways. And I think lack of communication whether it's due to a personality difference, a cultural difference, if people just don't have the kind of skills to create a good conversation, sometimes they can kind of lead employees to question their personal worth and their purpose within the organisation. So there's a lot of power with the manager and a lot of behaviours that can sometimes kind of be received in the way that the manager hadn't really intended them to be. And that can be really hard to navigate at work, I think, and it puts an extra level of kind of pressure and compromise on people's mental health. I think, if managers can really focus on communication skills and how to have mentally healthy conversations with their employees, where it's all about the employee and the employee really is the priority of the conversation rather than, the manager or work or whatever it might be, sometimes they can be really important as well. And I think it's also worth mentioning, sometimes with our managers, with our colleagues, with our leaders, if we're uncertain about that relationship and if we're uncertain about our position within that relationship, we often kind of question ourselves and we sort of turn inward and we think, gosh, my behaviour was, what did I do to feel like that? It must be my problem, rather than kind of reflecting on what someone else might be able to do. And sometimes I think that's not particularly healthy for our well-being, and it can be someone else's behaviour that we're kind of putting on ourselves. There's a toxic behaviour that I find quite interesting at the moment, and just to add another layer of confusion to things and how we kind of navigate our behaviours, but the kind of concept of toxic positivity, in that we have this kind of innate human need sometimes to want to put a positive spin on things. Actually, sometimes that can kind of create some challenging behaviours as well, where people don't necessarily feel like their feelings or their emotions are being validated enough. For example, if a colleague perhaps has had a cancer diagnosis at work, and they might tell their team about it. If your colleague goes back to them and says, gosh, I'm really sorry to hear that, it must be really hard for you, but hey, treatment's really good these days, you'll be back at work in no time, if you just have a positive attitude, you'll be absolutely fine. Actually, that really kind of doesn't validate the person's true emotions behind that, and you're almost kind of denying a human experience in that. So sometimes when we kind of shut people's emotions down, it can have a negative consequence, whereas actually if we can acknowledge them, we can acknowledge their challenges, acknowledge their worries, and really kind of try and boost them up, actually that can have a much more kind of positive effect on people as well. And I think generally as a culture, I think we're getting much better at reading other people's feelings and being empathetic and taking a breath before we come with our own thoughts, our own judgments, our own kind of input to the conversation. But there's still obviously kind of more to learn in terms of that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's a really great way of illustrating that often the things in our culture or our behaviours and how we work together that are perhaps not enhancing mental health, could even be eroding it, can come from a place of care, can come from a good intent that I care about you, I want to make you feel better, so I'm going to try and bring some positivity to it, but actually it just dismisses and demeans your true experience and completely minimizes what you're feeling right now that is valid and that is just. But it can come from a place of great intention, and that's where, when we think about developing behaviors and developing tools and techniques and really practical things that we can do to improve cultures of mental health, self-awareness is a tool, technique, and it is a practical thing. Being able to spot how I'm making someone else feel, being aware of my own behaviors and knowing to adjust it, and knowing you just need me to listen to you and say, wow, I'm really sorry you're feeling that way. I'm sorry you faced that diagnosis. That must be really hard for you, is so much better than the good intended, it'll be fine, like you're really strong, fight it, and sort of those things that actually aren't helpful and can make someone feel an awful lot worse. Absolutely. And I think there's a comment here, is that the difference between sympathy and empathy? I would say toxic positivity is one step worse than sympathy. Sympathy is like, oh, I'm sorry you're feeling that way, and there's maybe a little bit of a power dynamic that you're sort of looking down upon and you feel sorry for them. Toxic positivity is that, but worse, because it's like, you're going to be fine. I'm not even going to allow you to feel that way, because we're all going to be fine and we're all going to be happy. And I think that was one thing for me that I reflected a lot in the pandemic is, do I give myself enough chance to really feel all the feelings, to have bad days as well as good days, And am I honest and vulnerable enough with my colleagues that whenever I'm sharing that, because that's part of it. A rich, fulfilling, meaningful human life is going to experience every emotion, and that needs to be reflected in work as well. We need to stop sort of seeking this 100% happy all the time, because that's not actually good for our psychological health as well. You also mentioned, Claire, there the idea of different cultures, and I know that you work globally, and you're always taking that lens in everything you do at Oracle. What do you notice in terms of cultural differences and maybe any adaptations you need to take?
Yeah, you're quite right, and there are many differences in terms of culture, and I think when you talk about mental health as well, actually the starting point can even be confusing in itself, in that, you know, we're very familiar with the title of mental health, but actually some cultures, it doesn't really translate to them in that particular way. And then if we kind of come from an education perspective, or we're starting to talk about mental health, and then we add in mental well-being, and then we maybe talk about a continuum of, you know, mental health and well-being, and then resilience, and then we're adding in stress as well, and burnout. Actually, they're all titles that mean different things in different cultures, and that can be really challenging to kind of create the starting points, as well as obviously the challenge of different cultures having, you know, a kind of maturity in their understanding of it. So, for example, in the UK, and increasingly more so in Western Europe, we're quite kind of a mature, I guess, understanding of mental health. We kind of understand the challenges, we're much more accepting of them, and it is, as we just talked about, actually communicating freely about them is something that we do quite often. Whereas in some of our kind of Middle East countries, actually, it's kind of a bit of a taboo subject, you know, at the moment, and they don't really understand it, and they don't really understand the concepts behind it. So I suppose what's interesting to think about really is that mental health as a title, the feelings that you have behind it are the same, whatever your culture. So wherever you're from in the world, whatever you're going through, you know what, you know, you can experience loneliness, you can experience anxiety, you can experience grief, you can experience burnout. You might not necessarily know what the title is and how to put it on there and how to label it and how to communicate it with people. But actually, if you have those shared experiences and you talk about those shared experiences, then that's a really good way to kind of share them. And actually, to Leanne's point, an example of what we've done internally is we have an EC EMEA team who really wanted to focus on mental health, but rather than do it and call it mental health explicitly, we spoke about well-being. We did a limited kind of amount of applied theory and definition on the topic, and then we spent a lot of time talking about employee experiences, manager experiences of when they've been leading their teams and what they've done to kind of support their teams. And there were some brilliant examples of, you know, people just sharing how different their personality types are, how, you know, they perhaps spotted a change in their one of their team members, and they just said, you know what, take the afternoon off, I'll deal with everything, forward it to me, and you have your time and do it. And for them to just share those examples across, you know, a big team, all hands, actually just speaks volumes. So rather than, as I said, talking about mental health, putting a title on it, you're actually just sharing the kind of experiences and the solutions in a really kind of proactive, supportive way.
Fantastic. I love that. I really think that idea of, yeah, let's proactively get those solutions out there, really try and engage everyone. I think that is absolutely fantastic. And I think there's something around, you know, really understanding those cultural differences and being able to respect them, adapt to them, that can just be applied to our approach for everything. They're recognizing there's cultural differences within a national culture, within an organization, subcultures within teams. And I think that lens of really understanding individual differences and being as adaptive and proactive as possible is just great advice for all of us. Thank you, Claire. Absolutely. So we're talking about a lot here. We're talking about, you know, building your action plans, using data to inform them, making sure they're ongoing and continued, thinking about transformational change, but also behavior change and evolving cultures, adapting across cultures, the role of leadership, communication. There is a lot here that is really tangible that we can all work on, and I'm sure all are working on. So I'd love, there's so much great stuff coming through in the chat already, but if there's anything that you find is really working in your organization to improving the culture of mental health, do drop that in the chat as well as we go, so we can crowdsource as many solutions as possible. But while that happens, Leeanne, I want to come back to you, because we're talking here about lots that can be done, and some of that's going to require different behaviors, different ways of working from everyone across the organization to make it really sustainable. What about when we're all overwhelmed? You know, what came up early when we did that poll and in the chat first thing in this session was around we're all overwhelmed. How do we do this effectively when everyone is feeling exhausted, burnt out and overwhelmed?
I think it comes back to the point that Claire made about line managers having quality conversations with their people. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry.
No problem. Someone wants to have a quality conversation with you right now.
I thought I'd stop that. I'm so sorry about that, guys. It's completely thrown me off. What I was saying was about line managers understanding their people, and really, I think that in my experience, it's really important that my line manager knows exactly where I'm at, is able to explain to me what the bigger picture is, what the organisation is trying to achieve, but being conscious of where I'm at professionally and also at home. And so really they're the buffer, aren't they, between what is happening all around us and then what I'm actually feeling. So I think that's the key here. It's everything that Claire said, really, in terms of giving our line managers the tools, equipping them with the right language as well, to be able to have those quality conversations, to be able to bring their people on board, understand exactly what's going on, and be able to answer that question. I think for me, selfishly, I always ask, well, what's in it for me? And if they're able to answer that question, then I think that you've got them, and you're going to get people, you know, working productively, positively.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're back to this idea of the importance of line managers again, and sort of linking to that then, Liz, I'm keen to hear a little bit more about what you've been doing to develop the capabilities that leaders and line managers need. We've talked about everything from their ability to have those conversations through to concepts such as empathy early on, compassion. How do you develop that?
Yeah, good question, Jill. So I think the most successful programs that I've run have started with feedback and awareness to the participants. So using some really good, you know, trusted 360-degree feedback tools is always a very good starting point, because I think, you know, we all do it. We have a view of ourselves, you know, how we think we are. And then we get this feedback from, you know, our team members, our line managers, our colleagues, and it can be quite different. And that can be quite a surprise actually to many people. So I found this is always, you know, a really good starting point for a development program. You know, and alongside that goes the education piece, you know, around the different topics that we've talked about already. You know, we usually start with, you know, the good old fashioned foundation in management program, where you're looking at, you know, things like, you know, giving and receiving feedback, you know, what does a, you know, strong team look like? What's your role as a manager? So all those usual topics. But I think particularly in my organisation now at DeLonghi, we really ask people when they join our business to enter a lifelong learning journey with us. So we don't just do a one-off management development program. We build on that, and we focus on managers and leaders at different levels of the organisation as well. But in my experience, I found, you know, people have got to have a base level of knowledge about what good management skills are. And from there, you can begin to build on that. And then you can begin to focus on more complex topics, for example, emotional intelligence. But I think you've got to build those strong foundation blocks first. And likewise, oh, sorry, Jill, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry, go on ahead.
And, you know, I think alongside that, actually, it's not just managers and leaders that we've educated around the topic of well-being. You know, in particular, we've done that for everybody in the organisation. So everybody has that opportunity to learn for themselves, you know, what is mental well-being? We all have it, you know, and arming them as well with very practical tools and techniques so they can help themselves. Because I think, you know, I hope I haven't come across as it's all the managers and leaders' fault. You know, we're all in this together, really, aren't we? We're in this system and this environment together. So we do just as much for employees around educating them as we do for managers and leaders, really. The other thing I was going to say is we use feedback from other sources as well. So we run a very successful employee engagement survey, and there are specific questions in there around individuals' relationships that they have with their managers, and a whole section on wellbeing as well. So we're able to use that as different sources of feedback, and we have our appraisal process, and we encourage managers to have regular one-to-one meetings with their team members as well. So lots of different things, I would say, go into making that a successful development program.
Yeah, fantastic. And I know I've heard from you a lot about, how that has played out and the impact you've seen, that real tangible impact of your development programs on the culture, which is great to see. And I think, what you're talking about there in terms of giving people tangible skills, so important, but also developing their sort of inner psychological world. That's what we do at Feel Good. All of our leadership programs, whether it's our Brilliant Minds, mental health for managers, or our Leading Change, Leading in Hybrid World program, we develop the me and the we. What is that self-awareness, the confidence, the flexible thinking, the empathy and emotional intelligence, but also we develop the we. How do we behave with other people? And I think a good program needs both of those. And sometimes we forget about the me bit and we just focus on the skills, the tangible, what you see. And to the question that I saw in the chat a second ago that I've lost, but it was along the lines of, well, what do you do with a manager who doesn't want to change, who's not interested in this, and how do you develop them? For me, I would start with the me. Why do they not want to change? Is it because they have developed these defense mechanisms to support themselves in this overwhelming, high pressure world of work? And actually, they don't want to even lift the lid on what they're feeling, what other people are feeling because of that. Or do they not want to change because they just have never walked in someone else's shoes and realized some people might not be able to cope with the pressures that they do, because everyone copes with different stresses in different ways. So rather than trying to just force new skills on them and develop them, if you're getting a lot of resistance, change the conversation, focus on the me, get into their psychological world, explore their mindsets and work with that before you take them to the tangible skills. But I'm finding in most organizations, there's a lot of appetite for this. People are saying, how do I do this? How do I do this? I want to, I care. And that's where the approach you've described, Liz, I think is just so perfect that you're doing both at the same time, for sure. Conscious, we could talk about leadership development I could for days. In fact, I do, because that's part of my job. But I think just as we sort of come towards the end of the session, I want to just work with this idea of buy-in a little bit more as well. Because for all of the solutions that we're talking about, you do need buy-in. You need buy-in both from the top of the organization, that sponsorship, the budget, all of that, but also you need to get engagement across the whole workforce. And Claire, I'm keen to come back to you and hear your reflections on this, because I know you guys have been really creative at Oracle in terms of doing different things to get buy-in. What have you been finding that's been working?
Yeah, well, it won't surprise you to learn I haven't found the silver bullet yet, which is probably why I do so many different bits and pieces. But yeah, and I do often joke that actually my job's kind of 80% communications and engagement rather than and only kind of 20% of the actual well-being, because obviously you want to make sure you shared the message in the most important way you can. We've tried lots of different things. So we have been doing we try and change and we try and evolve all the different media we use. So we do some bite-sized films, we do leadership films that are kind of 1 minute long, where we've just got a clip from them with subtitles. We do articles, we do topics, we have blog posts. We've started doing podcasts with the idea that rather than people sitting at their desk watching a Zoom, when Zoom fatigue is one of the challenges that we know we've got a lot of in the organisation, we're actually kind of hopefully giving employees permission, use this time. We want you to take it to go for a walk, to get outside, to move around, turn your camera off and engage with us in that way. We know through our survey that one of the things our employees have been saying is that they just don't have enough time. They don't have enough time to devote to their well-being, to their learning, to all sorts of different things. And we all feel it ourselves, I think, that time is really tight. So one thing we've also been doing is trying to kind of timestamp things, like this article is a 3-minute read. If you're listening to this podcast and you want to know about the counsellor's insight, go straight to minute 14. If you want to learn about posture, go to minute 22, and try to kind of make it really easy for employees to kind of navigate it. We've done some panel discussions, which again were really good, going back to what we were saying earlier about leaders talking about their experiences, sharing stories and bringing that to life, and again being really authentic about it within the organisation. And we've done a couple with Feel Good which have been, you know, really well received, so that always kind of goes down really well. And then actually I just saw someone have put, well, there were a couple of comments in the chat about menopause, and actually one of the things that we've seen work really well, and going back to what Liz was saying about not always being top down, is we do have an employee resource group who have been focusing on menopause, and one of them put together a deck, just a short kind of overview that she shared within her team meeting. And then she obviously kind of built up the confidence and felt passionately enough about it to be able to share with her team. And since then, the kind of deck that she's got has been shared with other people who've been given the confidence to kind of go forwards and share that with their teams. And her manager shared it with his team as well. So actually there's kind of been a natural cascade, bringing attention to you know, a really important topic, and a totally different way of kind of creating engagement through, again, the authentic voice, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love both a variety of different things that you've been trying. And as you say, you haven't found a silver bullet because there probably isn't one. And we maybe need to all just sort of accept that and go, this is going to be about a multidimensional approach. And I love that idea of let's involve people, let's get them involved in creating this, because if people shape it, then they are going to feel like they own it. They're going to get that engagement and that energy. And that's back to some of the comments around, you know, well, what if leaders are stubborn and don't want to change? Well, you've got leadership in all sorts of guises in the organization, and tap into that energy to create a social movement. And I love that example of the menopause session and how you were able to harness sort of employee enthusiasm for that, but also role model vulnerability and sharing as well. I love that idea. Fantastic. I'm conscious of our time because we've obviously got our extended 30-minute Q&A, and there's lots of really juicy questions that I can see in the chat here that I know we're keen to dive into, that will really take us a little bit further beyond the conversation we're having here about really getting under the surface with what your unique challenges are, you know, engaging everyone in that solution, using your data and making sure that you're opening up communication, trying different things as well, but ultimately putting that sort of focus of building a compassionate and empathetic organization right at the core. So we'll talk much more about that in the 30-minute Q&A shortly. But before we do that, we're keen to just hear one more thing from all of you as well in another poll. So if we could open that poll as well. What I'm interested to know here is, what do you think is your biggest challenge in approaching leadership to create this lasting culture of care that we're talking about? So we've heard lots in the chat and from our panelists around getting buy-in is important, making sure that they get on board. Some leaders aren't thinking about this, they aren't prioritizing it. The word stubborn's come up, that they just don't think it matters and they're really fixed on that. What is your biggest challenge in terms of getting leadership bought in on this topic? Maybe you don't have a challenge, and if that's the case, that's okay. But if you do, is it reaching leaders? Is it getting budget approval? Is it getting the right leaders bought in, creating the right content to help them really understand what the challenge is here, finding the right providers to support you, knowing where to start the whole process, knowing what development is needed? Let us know in a very quick poll, and we'll keep this open just for 1 minute. Let us know what's coming through for you. And again, if there's something that you're finding that is really specific that isn't on the list, or that is driving your choice here, let us know in the chat. And I think Claire, thank you for sharing. Leaders having the capacity. Yeah, it's back to that word we used earlier, overwhelm. They have so much on their plates already. And I think that's something about, you know, how do we start this conversation with them that helps them see that this isn't something additional, it's about doing what they're doing in a different way. So they're already spending times with their teams. They're already thinking about how do we work together, but how do you do that in a different way? Because I think capacity is such an important part. Absolutely. Having the time to implement it. Yeah, so time, capacity, this theme of leaders are overwhelmed. Absolutely. Leaders feel they lack the capacity. Yeah, there's a very strong theme coming through here for sure. I think that's it. It's about breaking this down into small iterative things. Big change doesn't always have to come from big actions. The day-to-day experience of work is shaped by the small everyday things. If we can help leaders see that, yes, it might be transformational change in that the organization will look and feel very different in the future, but it can be done through everyday behaviors, everyday small nudges, small iterations to how they work. That can have a great step forward. Yeah, easier to do as you've always done, particularly when you're feeling fatigued, right, Jenny? It's like, oh yeah, we don't have the energy for that. And I think we see that coming through. Back to that point of helping leaders recognize it's manageable, it's digestible, but also supporting them first rather than layering more pressure onto them. Absolutely. This idea of opening the can of worms is unmanageable. Yeah, and that's then really making sure that as part of that action plan that Leeanne was talking about earlier, that those of us in these roles of HR, L&D, OD, wellbeing leads, that we can help them see what the future could look like. Maybe they think, oh, we're going to find all these problems and not know what to do about it. Can you help them see the story in the data that helps them understand how to create that change? Absolutely. So if we could share the results of the poll just to see what factors have been coming up, that would be great. So getting the right leaders bought in, and there's a lot of emphasis on that word, is coming out as our number one factor, of a third of people saying that there. Yeah. So seeing some people getting energy from a lot of people, but is there key decision makers, key role models in your organization that you need to get bought in? It might be you need to really get inside their world and understand their priorities and tell the story in their language, as we were mentioning earlier. Absolutely. Reaching them, knowing where to start, knowing what development is needed. Back to Leanne's point around a data-driven approach being so important here. Absolutely. One thing that we are offering to help with this at Feel Good at the moment is we would like to offer a number of organizations an opportunity to have a free 45-minute coaching session with one of our psychologists. This is a chance for you and a group of your colleagues to come together to share with us what's going on in your organization. And we will do a bit of a deep dive into what we can do to help you understand your clear vision of where you could go, provide expert-led insight into what your specific blockers are to creating change in the mental well-being space. And in this session, work with you to design a clear action plan. So it's a light touch version of what Leeanne was talking about earlier. Spaces for this will be limited. So if you would like to sign up, please do so with the link below. And I think Ella will share that in the chat for you as well. And we will be getting in touch with a number of people who are sort of the first to sign up. I think, Liz, we did something similar with you at DeLonghi recently. Is there anything you'd like to share about what the process was like and what it enabled you to do?
It was great. I would highly recommend it to anybody, actually. I think it was just having that outside perspective, but you guys asking us some really good questions that I don't think we considered really. I think we were definitely jumping straight into actions without actually standing back and thinking, what are the real issues that we need to start to tackle within our organisation? What is the current environment within which we're operating? And what potentially is the near to medium term future going to look like for us, where we need to put measures in place to help our people. So yeah, it was really positive, Jill. Yeah, it made a big difference.
That's great. Thank you, Liz. So yeah, if you're interested, there's more details on the link here. Sign up, and then we'll be running a number of these sessions for you and your colleagues across April and May. So we'd love to see as many of you there as possible. Great. So I think that brings me to the end of this sort of the core webinar approach. And I think